Welcome. I'm just going to give it a second for people as they join in. It's great to have so many of you with us here today. So I am delighted to welcome you to our virtual talk today titled Recovering Relationships, Reading Lenape Wampum Belts in American Museums. As we begin, I start by saying that the Philadelphia Museum of Art recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hokink, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the Walking Purchase of 1737, displaced many Lenape from this land. The museum and its staff, including myself, strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to Lenape people and their vibrant communities today, including the federally recognized nations, the Delaware Tribe, the Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to Lenape ancestors past and present by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And it is an honor to welcome you all today. My name is Linnea West. I work in public programs here. And today's program will consider several wampum belts attributed to 17th century encounters among the Lenape Delaware people and William Penn. One example of such a belt is on view in our early American galleries, which were reinstalled and opened about 2 years ago. And so on this topic, we are delighted to learn more from our exceptional speaker today, Dr. Margaret M. Bruchac. Dr. Bruchac, thank you for being with us. Dr. Bruchac is an ethnographer, historian, museum consultant, performer, and she has long been committed to restorative interpretations of Indigenous history and material culture. At the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Bruchac is Associate Professor of Anthropology, Associate Faculty in the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, and Coordinator of Native American and Indigenous Studies. Her 2018 book, Savage Kin, Indigenous Informants and American Anthropologists, received the inaugural Council for Museum Anthropology Book Award. She directs a restorative research project called the Wampum Trail that focuses on the history, meaning, materiality, curation, and repatriation of historical wampum objects in museums. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. She's also the author of Broken Chains of Custody, Possessing, Dispossessing, and Repossessing Lost Wampum in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Society, among many other research articles. So truly, it is wonderful to have you here with us. Today's talk relates to work that has been done in the early American galleries here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art to present a fuller narrative of art in the Americas. And this is the work of many colleagues, and I'd particularly like to thank Kathy Foster, the Robert L. McNeil Senior Curator of American Art and Director for the Center of American Art, and Rosalie Hooper, Head of Interpretation, for their work in this area and for connecting us with Dr. Bruchac and her important research. So for today's program, we will begin with Rosalie speaking for just a few minutes to sort of contextualize how and why we have this wampum belt on view in our newly reinstalled early American galleries. And then Dr. Bruchac will present on her research for about 40 minutes. We are saving time at the end for Q&A, and I hope you have many questions. Please use the Q&A box. The Q&A box has a helpful upvote feature, so if you see a question in there that you want to hear answered, you can give it a thumbs up. It'll go to the top of the queue, and those are the questions we will get to first. We will also be using the chat to share links, and thank you all for those of you who are saying hello in the chat. It's great to see so many of you joining us. Closed captioning is available. You can turn closed captions on or off by clicking the CC button in your Zoom toolbar. And finally, we are recording this program. Everyone who registered will get a follow-up email tomorrow, and it'll include any of the links we share in the chat, as well as a link to this recording, which will live on Zoom for about a week. So you'll have some time to look back at it, or if you're unable to join us live, you'll have some time to look at it. all of that said, Rosalie, I'm happy to turn it over to you, and then if you could just directly pass it over to Marge, that would be great.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Linnea, thanks so much for inviting me to join this talk. As you mentioned, I'm going to try and keep my remarks very brief because I'm also looking forward to hearing Dr. Bruchac's presentation. Can you go to the next slide, Linnea? So as Linnea mentioned, I was part of the project team that helped develop the Philadelphia Museum of Art's new early American art galleries, which display works of art made and used in the Americas from about 1650 through 1840. While we were planning, the team really shared a sense that we could not tell a full story of American art without including the indigenous artists and artisans who had been making art on this continent for thousands of years and whose rich artistic traditions, of course, continue on to this day. This was a change in approach for this museum, which, after an agreement made with the Penn Museum in the 1930s and 40s, generally did not display or collect artwork made by Indigenous Americans. So in order for us to represent this story in our galleries, we looked to other institutions for loans. The early American art galleries do have a general focus on the region that we now call Philadelphia, which we attempted to channel in our presentation of Indigenous artwork by focusing on the Lenape artists and artisans. I should also add that throughout the process of developing the early American art galleries, we were the grateful recipients of much guidance, support, and insight from a team of representatives and enrolled members of the federally recognized Lenape nations. Could you go to the next slide, Linnea? This wampum belt is probably the most well-known piece made by Lenape artists in this period. We believe that it was given by Tamanend and other Lenape leaders to William Penn during treaty negotiations in or around 1682. And after much discussion, we were able to borrow this object from the collection of the former Atwater Kent Philadelphia History Museum, which is now being stewarded by Drexel University. Next slide. We're so grateful to be able to be the temporary custodians of this belt and to give it a place of prominence at the entrance to our galleries, where it's a highlight of many general visits and many school tours. If you're beginning to tell the story of American art in Philadelphia in the 1600s, we can really think of no better starting point. The wampum belt's viewed by many as if not the foundational object of Philadelphia, and it evokes both aspirations to peace and coexistence and the failed reality of these hopes. We attempted to underscore these complicated meanings in how the wampum belt is presented in the gallery, which you can see here in conversation with these portraits of Lenape leaders, Tishkahan and Lafawinsa, who were participants in the infamous walking purchase swindle orchestrated in part by William Penn's sons, which greatly accelerated the forced removal of the Lenape from their ancestral homelands. If you haven't had the opportunity to see this wampum belt in person, we hope that you'll get a chance to do so soon. It's really difficult to do its craftsmanship justice with these small images on a screen. But now I will happily pass things over to Dr. Bruchac, who will tell us much more about this and other remarkable examples of wampum. Thank you.
Quahog, greetings. Could you stop share so I can get into my PowerPoint? Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, greetings. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us today. I come to you from Lenape territory at present, but my homeland is in Dakina, Abenaki territory. And today I'm here to share with you some insights into research conducted on the Wampum Trail. Now, as I'm sure many of you realize, in museum contexts, native objects are often considered to be both inanimate and silent, having been physically and conceptually detached from the relations that gave them meaning. And so when revisiting these collections, there are many questions. How do these object beings speak to those who collect, curate, and observe them? Their material components obviously reflect particular ecosystems, eras, cultures, and technologies, but I believe they also retain memories of the artisans who create them. And when we retrace the origins of these objects, these memories can perhaps be reawakened. So my focus today is on a cluster of wampum belts that have been identified as William Penn or Lenape belts, due to their association with those 17th century relations. 2 of these belts are housed at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. One, as you know, is shown here on both sides. It's a single belt, but we're looking at it from 2 different angles, is now housed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And then there are 3 other curious belts that may or may not be associated with these. One is at the British Museum, one at the Penn Museum, and one at the Royal Ontario Museum. Now, until fairly recently, wampum belts like these were de facto imagined as though they were inherently unknown and unknowable. And yet, if we look more closely at material details, we can better understand how these objects came into being. So before delving into the belts themselves, let me share some of those details. The generic term wampum, borrowed from the Algonquian word wampum pig, meaning white shell beads, refers to both white and purple cylindrical beads used for adornment and diplomacy. The beads were carved from marine whelk. The white beads come from either Bizicon caniculatum or Bizicon caraca, and purple beads from quahog, mercenaria mercenaria. These are harvested from the coastal waters along present-day Long Island Sound, up the coast of Massachusetts, and onto the St. Lawrence. The individual beads contain traces of their marine origins, and they also cohabit the same environment. So they need both fresh water and salt water. Now, the white beads, best taken when these particular shell beings are young, have a natural pearl-like sheen being carved from the inner whorls of whelk. The purple beads, best taken when these shell beings are many decades old, ideally 60 years or more, have a very deep purple sheen. The oldest quahog are so dark and dense at the edges as to be almost black. Now, assemblages of these beads, when woven into figurative or symbolic patterns, have long been used by North American indigenous peoples, particularly the Haudenosaunee and Algonquian peoples, for conducting and recording diplomatic understandings. Now, the dramatic difference in color density is what enables a really effective binary signaling system. In general, white signifies ease, harmony, coherence, cohesion, agreement, and in general, purple signifies complexity, difficulty, and sometimes it can signal a concentration of resources or potential power. Now, these individual designs carry both general and specific meanings. The messages in belts like these were most clearly seen when they were utilized in diplomacy, so quite literally displayed in acts of cultural performance, ceremonially being held up while words were spoken over them. Some belts were meant to have a single message and to be preserved for all time, and some belts had messages that could be reused in different contexts. So a path belt might operate in one agreement, but also be effective for another agreement, or it might be meant to be carried from place to place to place to ease the way. Now, this zigzag design, for example, represents a path that moves around and over and through obstacles. A 19th century linguist, Jean-André Quahog, very eloquently noted how there is a correspondence between the Mohawk word for wampum, kahione, and the wampum itself, and the rivers and travels that are conducted by tribal diplomats. He noted, this object in the form of a band or ribbon simulates a river because of its elongated configuration and because of the wampum beads of which it is composed represent the flows and the waves. Just as a navigable waterway facilitates the mutual meeting of nations, so the kahione, the constructed river, is a sign of covenant, concord, and friendship. Now, this particular object is called a dish belt. And in this case, it reflects the dish with one spoon concept, the idea that people can share out of a common pot in a particular territory. The purple dish, which is situated within a large territory of white beads, embodies and communicates the reciprocal relations among humans and other than human beings in a shared ecosystem. The political message, as it was recorded by Onondaga wampum keeper John Skanawati Buck, was that they will have one dish and what belongs to one will belong to all. And these are just a few examples so you have some sense of how wampum symbolism works and how belts were woven to encode these particular meanings. Now, this belt is an example of a covenant chain or alliance belt with two figures representing two nations that are in alliance with one another, holding on to either end of a covenant chain. Now, note that both figures have, or I should say, once had weapons in their hands. This belt was altered at some point. If you look at the right side, you can see the long strands were cut and the weapon was removed from that particular figure. But when the belt was originally made, both figures had weapons, because the essence of an alliance or a covenant chain is that although you could hurt one another, you ground your weapons and you agree not to hurt one another. And as long as you are both holding onto the chain, whatever happens to one will be perceived by the other. And so you are forever linked. And this is the kind of belt that was meant to remain in perpetuity. It has been broken over time. We don't know exactly how or why, but this is the condition it lives in the museum today. Now, wampum construction is interesting in and of itself and is actually diagnostic, because the messaging in wampum is not limited to the images and the beads. Native artisans harvested plant fibers and animal hides to create the weaving materials, hemp, milkweed, sinew, leather, etc., for warp and weft, and then put these into distinctive patterns of weaving and assemblage. Belts were woven in a basic square weave manner, as shown in the illustration on the left by Frank Speck. And those distinctive crosses and twists at the edges created a sturdy but very flexible object. Slight alterations in these techniques actually reflect regional traditions and particular artisans. So if you look at the three examples here of historic wampum belts from the early 1800s, what you see is, or I should say early 1700s, what you see at the top is a simple cross where the two strands just cross. These are the weft at the edges, weft strands at the edges. The second one is a cross and twist, where they cross and twist around one another before going up into the next row. And then the bottom belt had a more complicated cross and twist, but it also was originally woven with sinew fibers. And this is an example of indigenous repair. Whereas the sinew started to break down, indigenous people who still held onto the belt started to repair it with other fibers. And so sometimes objects will show those traces of indigenous curation and repair. Now, in terms of the warp and weft, in general, weft is plant fiber, in general, warp is leather, but these can vary. And there are many, many varieties. So in general, there are different sizes of beads. There may be long beads or square beads. And then the way the ends are treated can also tell us something about the belt itself. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, this is a Huron-Wendat belt from the late 1600s. It has very, very small leather strands, but you can also see some of the strands are repurposed from other belts. You can see how the beads are very small. If you look at the upper right, you see the rough cut of that leather, and that's what I sometimes refer to as a field-dressed belt, where the leather was cut on the spot without any attempt to make it perfectly even, but just to expediently bring the belt into being. And there are many, many variations. Now, all of these and all of these knowledges between different materials, between ocean and land, forest and shore, flora and fauna, dark and light beads, all of these play into the making of wampum. Now, a number of historic wampum belts contain anomalous beads. These may be individual beads here and there, rarely across an entire belt, unless the belt is entirely of these anomalous beads. But in a shell belt, there are often one or two odd beads. So on the left, you can see a single blue glass bead. On the upper right, you can see a dentalium bead. And on the lower right, you can see a single steatite bead. These, I believe, are markers placed by the indigenous artisans who wove these belts. There was a time when scholars said, oh, this is simply an accident. Someone grabbed the wrong bead. But trust me, the making of wampum is so meticulous and so complicated that one cannot mistake one bead for another. Now, in some collections, there are broken belts, fragments of belts. Some of these were broken through heavy use, some were disassembled, and some were intentionally broken. Because in the midst of wampum diplomacy, if an agreement falls to pieces, one way to signify that is to literally break the belt that holds that agreement. And there is also evidence in some of the belts that have been preserved of indigenous curation and repair. This is a case, this is what is often known as the two-dog wampum belt from Minnesota. And this particular belt has been repaired multiple times by multiple hands. But even before it was repaired, you can see that it was brought together from multiple components, including beads from other belts. So in this case, some of the beads show traces of red ochre from a belt that was entirely colored. There are beads of varying ages and density and color. And then there are different kinds of strands being used. You can see some of the leather strands have been colored red, and some of them are plain colored leather. So in many cases, the fact that we only have roughly 400 to 500 belts in existence now, that may represent the fact that there were other belts that preceded those that were taken apart and woven into them. But that's another conversation. So just quickly moving through these insights, these are some of the details that we're finding in the process of doing this kind of research. Now, all of these traces are highly visible in the objects themselves, but curiously, they are not typically well documented in museum records. And this is in part because during the salvage anthropology era, when many of these belts came into museums, the museums were largely focused on the idea of these being random, exotic, salvaged objects without understanding the knowledge that went into actually constructing them. So as part of the Wampum Trail project, we devised what we call relational research approaches. And this is a means to overcome the habitual erasure in museum collections by talking with the communities that create these objects, by encouraging curators and museums to talk to one another, and by opening up to better understandings of the past. Now, this project was inspired by my dear friend and colleague Rick Hill, who was at the time the director of the quahog Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations in Oswego, Ontario. And my two research assistants, Lise Puyo on the left and Stephanie Mock in the middle, have been absolutely instrumental in this project. And as part of this team, we traveled to multiple locations, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it just gives you a snapshot of the collections we've been looking at. So we've gone into collections across the northeastern US and Canada and on into England. Our goal initially was to survey these collections, conduct interviews, and collect data that would allow us to conduct more comprehensive object histories while connecting these objects with their communities. And we're also working along the way to try to bring curators and Indigenous knowledge keepers into communication with one another. So for instance, here at the Penn Museum, you can see Lucy Fowler Williams, the curator of the American section, in consultation with Pete Jemison, who is the Seneca Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, discussing two wampum belts in that museum collection. Now, all of these belts in museums recorded significant moments of Indigenous diplomacy in the aftermath of colonial warfare, or sometimes before the colonial warfare. But during their stay in museums, these meanings were forgotten, and distorted meanings emerged when wampum belts were represented simply as valuable antiquities and apparently unknowable objects. And so this is what led us to devise what I call restorative methodologies. Now, these seem like relatively logical approaches, and they appear straightforward to me, but they are not always done. And I would suggest that part of that is because museum curators and museum staff have been trained to create categories and then to assign objects to those categories and then to apply labels to them that fit what is already known. So sometimes an existing label may be applied to an object because it appears to fit, but it may be the wrong label. So just as a few brief examples, when we go into collections, we always look at the materials first and look at the records second, because the objects themselves can often reveal details about how and when and where they were made and who was implicated in their making. When we do archival research, we typically share whatever documentation we find with the relevant communities. So in this case, Lise Puyo is consulting with tribal experts at Kitigan-Zibi about the wampum belt that lives in the Vatican, which is a very long story in itself. When we conduct object cartography, we're not only trying to find out how an object has moved through various hands over time, but if there are other objects related in different collections, because often curators in these collections do not necessarily talk to one another. And often, again, by means of categorization, objects become orphaned from their sources. Critical scholarship, we reinvestigate everything. I am very, very reluctant to take museum traditions at face value, in part because they often came about from an earlier time when museums were not consulting with Indigenous people. So whenever there's a particular theory that guides how an object is understood, I try to determine who came up with that theory and what was their logic, and then revisiting all primary and secondary sources, because in many cases, secondary sources do not accurately reflect the primary sources. But more importantly, relational research means to encourage thoughtful, productive, nuanced conversations about what we know, what we think we know, how we came to know it, and what else we might learn that could help us better understand. And so these relational insights, there are many. These are just a few of the questions I use to conduct this kind of work. But it all leads down to the question at the end is, can this object still speak for itself? And so today, rather than focus on historical records, which are relatively easy to locate about William Penn and his conduct with Lenape people, I'd like to focus on the material records and show you some of the insights that I am finding from revisiting these belts. So the Wampum Trail project, as I know, began as a provenance survey, but it very quickly evolved through consultations into a deep material survey when we realized that we were recording traces of wampum construction, reconstruction, repair, and repurposing that had not been well documented before. So, as I noted, today I'll offer some reflections on the history and materialities of these belts, but I must note that this survey is still in the beginning stages in this particular category of objects. And this is due in part to travel delays caused by the pandemic. We had hoped to do much of this work in 2020 and 2021, and obviously life intervened. So most of these belts are still very patiently awaiting detailed study and consultations, but I can share some insights gathered thus far. The display case housing the two Penn Lenape belts at the National Museum of the American Indian notes that, quote, Lenape leaders presented both of these wampum belts to William Penn in the early 1680s as part of a land agreement or treaty of friendship, end quote. Setting aside for the moment the question of the validity of that treaty and the subsequent loss of both land and friendship through the duplicitous actions of colonial settlers, let's take a look at the materiality of these objects. Both belts are composed entirely of whelk and quahog shell beads. There are no glass beads, no stone beads, no anomalies. The white beads are very uniform in size and condition, and this indicates that they were either collected at the same time and carved at the same time, or sorted carefully from available beads to match. The beige diagonal striations visible on the white beads are what mark them as whelk, since beads carved from conch shell have no such striations. Most of the purple beads are very dark, although a few do show streaks that are typical of younger quahog shells. So people were using both old and young quahog. The beads are quite uniform in size, and all of this taken together indicates that these Lenape artisans had easy access to an abundance of beads. In other words, they were harvesting the shells directly from clean coastal waters and making the beads themselves, rather than relying on acquiring them through trade with other native nations. And native nations before colonial contact were widely trading and exchanging wampum, both in terms of loose beads, in terms of strings, and in terms of belts. And as I noted earlier, the belts are coming from beads that are coming from shells that grow in coastal waters. And so if you don't have direct access to those waters, then you need to trade with native nations who do. And something else I should note is that one reason for the scarcity of wampum shells and wampum beads in the 19th and 20th century was the increased commercial fisheries and harvesting along the shores, especially Yankee-style clam bakes, which tapped out the populations quite dramatically. So by the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, it was very, very difficult to find healthy waters and healthy old quahog. Now, both of these belts show weaving patterns that are, again, entirely consistent with 17th century belts elsewhere. You can see that cross and twist at the edges there. And then you can also note on the first belt, there is no dye on the leather strands, but on this other belt, the leather strands have been pre-dyed, so not colored afterwards, but dyed before they were woven in. And what you can note is that there are no repurposed beads. There are no really obvious notions of repair. And so this belt was made and meant to stay in this form in perpetuity, which again coheres with the documentation that we have of these exchanges. Now, this belt, this is the one that has the cross symbols. As I know, it has this dye treatment, and the dye was typically red ochre or vermilion. And you can see in some cases, there are small bits of this dye that have transferred and rubbed off onto some of the beads. But the belt also shows the wear of heavy handling, given the broken strands and missing beads at one end. And you can see that a little more clearly in this image here. So the meticulous knotting of the ends shown here serves several purposes. It held the strands tightly together, but it also indicated that the message was not intended to continue. So the message was meant to remain in this belt and only in this belt. And so a belt that was open-ended left the possibility for continuing a message, but a belt that is tied and knotted says basically this message stops here. Now, the Penn Lenape belt that currently lives at the Philadelphia Museum of Art was kept in the custody of the Penn family for several generations before returning to Philadelphia in 1857, when Penn's great-grandson, John Granville Penn, donated it to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And during the latter part of the 20th century, the belt was on display at the Atwater-Kent Museum, Philadelphia History Museum. Now, interestingly, when it was at that institution, the curators chose to qualify the authenticity by creating a lot of suggestion and inference rather than statement. So the display text identifies this object as a gesture, a symbol, and a legend, implying that perhaps there was no such agreement, which is rather odd given the materiality of this object itself recording the agreement. And in the current display, in the early American McNeil galleries at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the belt is not quite so qualified. There are no suggestions that it's a legend, but it's very simply identified. The text only says, as you saw earlier, wampum belt around 1682, likely not Lenape women artists, made in the Delaware Valley, clam and whelk shell beads, leather fiber. Now, the simple statement is, however, accompanied by these evocative paintings of two Lenape tribal leaders who, in a sense, are there to bear witness and to testify to both the aspirations and the failures of colonial accommodation. Now, the simplicity is also complicated by this land acknowledgement, in this case endorsed by the present-day Delaware nation, that names, quote, a long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, end quote. And this is relatively new for museums to admit what they do not know and for museums to make explicit reference to fractures and damages and violences of the past, because these objects made to record alliances often became witnesses to violence. Now, this particular object, like the two belts at NMAI, is entirely consistent with traditional indigenous wampum construction. It's composed entirely of whelk and quahog shell beads. The white beads are quite uniform in size and condition. They match the size and shape of the beads in the other two belts. There are beige diagonal striations marking the white beads as well. The purple beads are quite dark. And the weaving pattern, again, is the simple cross and twist with plant fiber weft and leather warp. There is breakage visible in some of the leather strands where rows of beads were once anchored. You can see that on the left side of this image. The leather strands were also once dyed red, but the color has faded perhaps because this belt shows signs of very heavy handling. Now, as with the other two belts, there are minimal signs of repair, and most of those are indigenous repair. Here's a little knotting in the middle of leather strands, and there are also on this a few traces of curatorial repair, but very few. And the color variation, by the way, has much to do with the setting in which these photographs were taken. Museum lighting, unfortunately, is not always friendly to capturing the actual color of wampum. But an interesting detail in this belt is that the figures themselves are heavily coated with something. At first glance, it appears to be wax. Perhaps they were in some way painted to protect them with something, but it also might be the traces of generations of hands touching them. And here I sort of imagine the residue of generations of Penn family members caressing these figures, perhaps recalling the peaceful kingdom they once envisioned. It's hard to say, but it's odd for a belt to be this dirty or this coated with external materials that I don't believe were originally placed there by the Lenape wampum weavers. Now, much of the scholarship on this belt is focused on the imagery, debating which of the two figures represents William Penn. Is it the big guy with the hat, or is the big guy with the hat actually a Lenape chief with a headdress? Personally, I would go with the second suggestion. But the longstanding suggestion that, quote, some believe the image represents Penn and a Lenape chief, suggesting that it might be a legend rather than a fact, that suggestion diminishes the power and the authority of wampum symbolism itself. Figures of two individuals holding hands, literally holding hands on a belt, represent an agreement that in a sense is even more powerful than a covenant chain. There is nothing between them. Their hands are clasped together and stuck that way in perpetuity. And that indicates that these figures, in a sense, like the dish belt, have agreed to living, cohabiting in a shared territory, sectioned by three rivers, where there is abundant resource for all. So again, here, the white represents abundant land, resources, ease of travel, harmony. The dark figures here do not represent danger, but complexity or density. So the figures standing in for the two communities, not representing individuals, as has been suggested, but representing the communities those individuals speak for. Now, one of the other colonial era wampum belts that might be associated with Lenape is this zigzag wampum, housed at the British Museum in London, England. Curator Jonathan King commented that at the time of accession, quote, the acquisition of this belt may have been a nationalistic impulse, inspired in part by the sale of the Penn belts to George High. And George High was the founder of the Museum of the American Indian, which then became the National Museum of the American Indian. Now, although the origins of this belt are not as well documented, the bead size, selection, condition, and weaving patterns are so very close to the other three known Lenape belts that there is a very strong possibility of Lenape association. Now, when this belt first came into the British Museum in the 1930s, then curator T.A. Joyce oddly identified it as Plains Indian without any basis whatsoever in fact. And it's a truly absurd designation because the Plains Indian people did not use wampum in a diplomatic manner. They did use wampum beads when they were brought to them in the early 1800s by Lewis and Clark and other expeditions, but wampum was not part of their ceremonial complex. And the other odd thing about these long curatorial notes is that they mix together fact and fiction, supposition and evidence in rather odd ways, including emphasizing the use of wampum as money in the colonial era. And this introduces unnecessary confusion, since there is no equivalency between the use of individual wampum beads as money and assemblages of wampum beads in wampum belts. Now, like the other Lenape belts and like Haudenosaunee belts from the same time period, this belt is woven in a square weave pattern and the weft fibers cross and twist at the edges. Now, research is ongoing on this particular belt, But I should note that it also includes an unusual piece, and this is the assemblage, the appendage of leather strands with a small pouch attached at one end. Some have identified this pouch as a turtle, but on close examination, it's clear that it once had a very long spatulate tail, and that tail now broken would be a beaver tail. And that particular pouch is composed of very, very small shell wampum beads. Now, there is another very intriguing bit of documentation that might point to this particular belt. In some cases, object histories can be recovered by locating contemporaneous images or texts, illustration, correspondence. Sometimes oral traditions survive that testify to an object's use. So this particular document, housed at the American Philosophical Society, illustrates 34 wampum belts carried by a Lenape delegation led by Chief Sasunen to a meeting with the Five Nations Haudenosaunee chiefs at Onondaga. The notes were preserved in the minutes of the Pennsylvania Provincial Council for May 19, 1712. And by the way, it's very unusual to find illustrations of wampum belts in colonial documents. Often they are merely written descriptions. So the text of this document includes an illustration of a zigzag wampum belt, which seems to resemble the belt of the British Museum, noting its significance in this particular meeting. And the text says that when they arrive, they would fully hear and understand them, and that they may have liberty to pass and repass in all places. So in other words, a zigzag belt is a variety of a path belt. So it enables the carriers to move across a territory, and in this case, a territory that includes up and down mountains, across rivers, and so on. And so the figure also represents the goal of carrying that belt. But there's more, because even more intriguingly, one of the images in this document seems to resemble one of the known Lenape belts. And the notation next to that illustration says, quote, "These two belts were given them, one by Governor Penn when here, the other sent since by Colonel Evans to Conestoga, which they are to carry with them, but desire they may now be instructed what was intended by them." So in other words, the text suggests that these belts were given to the Lenape by Penn, which is interesting because the belts themselves materially are not made by colonists. These particular belts are clearly made by indigenous artisans, but they could have been commissioned by Penn to give to Lenape to record a particular agreement. And furthermore, the document says, they were told they must show these belts to the chiefs of 5 nations as tokens of a firm and real friendship between them and us, that they were desired to acquaint the nations in a peaceable manner with how much friendship we have lived with them ever since William Penn first came into this land. So in other words, the Lenape are attempting to extend the treaty of peace and friendship they have with Penn to the Haudenosaunee and by extension to anyone else they come in contact with. We don't have any record of what happened when this delegation reached Onondaga, but there's something else I should note, because at this moment in time in 1712, the Penn belts, including the photo you see here, were in England. They were not here. And so the document illustrates belts that look like them. And that creates the impression, which makes perfect sense in indigenous thinking, that there were duplicates made, with one set of belts meant to remain with the Penn family and one set meant to remain with Lenape. And the intention was then to keep 2 versions of the same agreement in place on both sides of the ocean. Now, time does not allow for detailed discussion of the other belts, but let me share just a few insights on each of them. The Penn Museum houses 2 wampum belts, one of which I'll talk about today. One is a 14 diamond belt and the other is a path belt. And materially, this path belt features 8 rows, 31 inches long, with trailing warp ends. The shell beads are carved from the inner whorls of whelk and the outer edges of quahog. There's a slightly uneven coloration and shape, suggesting some of them might have been repurposed, but the warp is of brain tan leather and the weft is twined plant fiber. Now, the entire style of this assemblage, beads, warp, weft, weaving, etc., matches other northeastern indigenous wampum belts from the 17th and 18th centuries. Unfortunately, it's vaguely identified in the exhibition only as Iroquois, which is the most common designation given to wampum belts. And although the information in the online database is scarce, the archival records actually tell a much fuller story. The director's correspondence in the Penn Museum archives indicates that this wampum belt was once in the possession of Reverend Elkanah Holmes, who passed it down through other parties until it landed in the hands of antiquities dealer Walter Wyman, who in 1920 sold it to the Penn Museum for $500. And once I learned that Holmes was associated with this belt, then I started plowing through the missionary records and discovered a document. And again, this is relatively unusual to have a document that describes wampum in this kind of detail. So these documents are routine and were routinely produced, but rarely can we match them to a very specific belt. So in this particular case, the belt of wampum was delivered to Holmes, and it was indicated using the classic language of Haudenosaunee diplomatic encounters that the belt would represent a path that could be readily followed backwards and forwards to conduct diplomacy. The belt, in other words, would function as a sort of companionable passport for safe travel in dangerous times. The language of the document in this particular case very precisely describes this belt. In the width, in the message, including noting that it contains 8 rows of pure wampum, 2 of which are purple, signifying a plain wide path. The other 6 rows denoting the 6 nations of Indians, so this is the 6-nation Haudenosaunee Confederacy, are white, implying peace, 3 rows on each side of the path, implying safety and liberty for each party to pass and repass to visit each other. At each end of the belt or path is a square formed of purple and white wampum, signifying the Mexican Nation of Indians and the New York Baptist Association, united in love and friendship. But here's the curious thing, is that there is no actual alliance between the New York Baptist Association and the Mohican, but there was an alliance between the Haudenosaunee and the Mohican, otherwise known as the Stockbridge Mohican. In the late 1700s, shortly before this belt was given to Holmes, the Oneida Nation in central New York State, present-day central New York State, gave land to the Stockbridge to relocate when they were forced out of their territory in western Massachusetts. And in order for Stockbridge people who were not Iroquoian to safely travel and be accepted in Haudenosaunee territory, it would have been extremely useful for them to have a belt. So I believe this belt was actually given by the Oneida to the Mohican, only because when the Mohican gave it to Holmes, the original message and meaning started to be lost. Because over time, even though Holmes carried the belt with him, it ended up being transferred and ended up in a collector's stash, and then it ended up in the Penn Museum. And until very, very recently, the Penn Museum had made no effort whatsoever to identify the belt's origins. And in that sense, patrimonial memories were erased when it was simply accepted as a valuable commodity. And the last belt I'll talk about today, and perhaps the most bizarre example, is another one that lives at the Royal Ontario Museum that has been identified as a Penn belt, here in quotes. In this particular case, it's long been interpreted as though it is a replica of one of the iconic Penn wampum belts, but it bears a very odd resemblance, with the figures and coloring in reverse, rather jumbled. There's none of the meticulous attention to detail that we see in traditional wampum belts. It has rabbit fur attached at either end, and it has other odd details that do not resemble any other wampum belt in existence. Now, we do know that the belt came into the collections from Aronyateka, Peter Martin, a Mohawk from Tyendinaga, who was the founder of the Independent Order of Foresters, and his collection is at the Royal Ontario Museum. When he acquired this belt in 1887 from Chief Wabineau, who you see is the tall man pictured here, of the Moravian Reserve in Muncietown, Ohio, Wabineau said this belt was one of the original William Penn belts from 1682. Not coincidentally, Wampanoag was also one of the tribal chiefs invited to Philadelphia for the Penn Bicentennial in 1882, and you can see the program here on the right. And that was just 5 years before he sold this wampum belt to Oronyateca. Close examination of the belt raises many suspicions. The museum record says it's woven with bark and sinew, but neither are in evidence. The belt is in fact, as you can see on the bottom, woven using rough 19th century commercially manufactured brown carpet twine instead of hemp or plant fibers, as you can see in the pen belt shown at the top that it supposedly was made to resemble. Almost every detail of this rom belt is an anomaly. It does contain real shell wampum beads, but they're pulled together in a bizarrely knotted fashion, including these oddly horizontal rows at the edges of the belt. Many of the beads are poorly matched or doubled up, where one bead should suffice, two are stacked, where two should be, one is stacked. And a large number of the pale purple beads are positioned to stand in where white beads should be. The larger beads, in fact, match those that were made en masse in the early 1800s by members of the Campbell family in Pascack, New Jersey, for selling to traders, including the American Fur Company. Those beads are roughly twice the size of typical wampum beads, and they always show dramatic variations in size and color because they're being harvested from very young quahog, which doesn't yet have that dense purple quality. Now, the figures themselves are especially troubling. They should be pure white on a dark background. Again, wampum is binary. There is no pale color in wampum. There is either white or dark, light or dark. And so white beads on a dark background would indicate peaceful figures in an era of complexity. But in this case, the figures are composed of both white and light purple beads standing in for white. And the effect is that these figures have their feet descending into darkness, which is not a particularly peaceful message. So the gist of it is that this particular belt is a fabricated replica rather than a reweaving of an historic belt or an historic belt in and of itself. So in closing, by offering these brief reflections on wampum belts and wampum ceremonialism, I mean to demonstrate that despite decades of silence and collections, these object beings are waking up. Wampum belts have long been made and meant to wield not just imagined meaning or distributed agency, but literal power as conveyors of messages, as participants in diplomacy, and as other than human beings that can remember what perhaps human beings cannot. And these indigenous meanings can be best understood and recovered by always considering indigenous conceptions of animacy and relationship, which may not match with museum conceptions of provenance and origins. And I should also note that wampum diplomacy is in fact ongoing. So for example, when Tuscarora traditionalist Rick Hill negotiated a new knowledge-sharing collaboration between the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia and the Deohage Indigenous Knowledge Center in Ontario, he commissioned a very accurate replica of the path belt at the Penn Museum. In this case, using that same symbolism, two locations and a path between them. And in this case, the belt is composed of modern glass beads to represent the modern era and to record this agreement. And so let me make this point clear. Wampum belts were not originally designed to live in museums. They were brought into corporeal form to function as agents in encounters, as speakers in diplomatic settings, as partners in alliance, and as memories made material. And so just as the Haudenosaunee long used wampum, and Lenape as well, and all the Algonquian peoples, in rituals of diplomacy and condolence and relationship, the goal was to always guide grieving or conflicted parties out of conflict and towards clear-mindedness. So we too can improve our understandings of origin histories and of object stories and repair museum relations with the indigenous. The process of recovering meanings requires careful study, consultation, collaboration, and reciprocal relationships. Thank you.
Thank you. I can only echo the many comments of thanks in the chats for such a fascinating and informative presentation. It left me with actually many more questions, and I see we already have some questions in the chat. I recognize that we are running a little over our time, but we are still going to tackle as many of your questions as we can for those who can stay. Um, Again, please put them in the Q&A box, and if you see a question you like and you want to hear it answered, you can give it a thumbs up, and we'll get to those questions first. And people have asked so many questions that echo my own questions, so I'm really interested to hear these answers. Marge, the first question we have is from Maureen Greenwald, who asks, what do we know about who made the belts in terms of the tribe's social system? She's wondering if it was gendered.
It is and it is not. I'll make these rather short answers. So in general, among Algonquian peoples, gendered relations are not strictly male-female and are not strictly that often it's assumed that women do harvesting and craft work and men do hunting and that sort of thing. But really there was much more dispersal of these tasks. And so what we know from oral traditions and the archival records and the objects themselves is that wampum beads and wampum weaving was done by both men and women. When there are references in the colonial records are often referring to men conducting this work, but I would suggest that is in part because colonial observers are interacting with men. And the weaving is not something that is happening in full view of colonial observers, but it's happening in communities behind the scenes. So for example, we do have a few references in some of the New France records to Native women who were both collecting beads and weaving belts to make for particular circumstances. So it is and is not gendered.
Thank you. We have so many great questions coming in. I'll ask one from Kathy Foster, who says, thank you for a landslide of information. And her question is, if you have detected Indigenous repairs in the belt now at PMA, when would those have been made if the belt was given to Penn and held in his family?
So in that case, I believe the belt was made and handled among Indigenous communities before it was given to Penn. So some of these, that one in particular shows a lot of heavy handling. So again, we're inferring where the handling was. It's also quite possible, because Penn held on to it for the entire time he was here, that he may have handed it to someone for repair. So it doesn't show as much repair as others, but it does show a little bit of repair where there's breakage.
Yeah, and it's wonderful that you had a chance to examine this belt and speak to this. We have another a longer, more specific question from Care Houston, who says, great talks. She was at the National Museum of the American Indian yesterday, and she noticed a lot of variation in the widths of some of the horizontal elements. And you mentioned that the anomalous beads in some belts may have been markers. And so she's asking if you think variations in width or deviations in the pattern conveyed meaning.
Sometimes they do, sometimes they do not. Sometimes, as I know, when it's a field dressed belt, it's something that needs to be made on the spot for expediency. And I've seen a number of these now where there's no consistency in the width of the warp strands. But when there are groups of wampum makers who are making a number of belts at the same time, there often is cohesion there. And there is cohesion among different belts made in particular time periods. So again, I'm making a broad general answer to that because these are details we're still in the process of collecting. So sometimes I can tell you what I know based on seeing 20 belts, and sometimes I won't have an answer until I've seen 40 belts, and sometimes I'll need to see all 400 before I can confidently say that. But what I can confidently say is that there's no question in my mind that these Indigenous artisans were fully cognizant of every detail involved in construction. And that's why the belt that's at the Royal Ontario Museum is such a bizarre case, because there is not that kind of attention to detail.
No, that is a fascinating story to end on for sure. Karen Dunleavy asks how much time it took to weave a single belt.
What I know from where there are records is that often it would take weeks sometimes longer, because as the belt was being made, the agreement was being encoded. Sometimes it was quick. So for instance, Sir William Johnson, who was the British Indian agent for much of the early 1700s in central New York State, in what was then New York Colony, Johnson's records record many, many, many diplomatic meetings with the Haudenosaunee, but they also record in his expense reports, he is hiring Mohawk women to weave belts. And sometimes in those records, you'll see a belt given, a belt taken, a belt set aside. And sometimes those belts set aside are quite literally being taken apart to turn into other belts. So if one needed, let's say, a average, 1.5 foot long belt for a ceremony in the middle of a meeting, it could be made in the course of a day if one needed it quickly. But if it was a really significant belt, it would take much longer. And then there are some cases where we've seen belts that have been composed of other belts quite literally pieced together. So it varies.
It varies, absolutely. Lori Shepard asks, are there any Native curators and conservators working on wampum belts held in museum collections?
Oh, yes. In fact, as we speak, an entire collection of belts is coming from the Quai Branly Museum in France to Ganondagan, the Seneca Historical Center in Western New York State. And there the curators are Michael Galbin and Jonathan Laney and a number of other people that are working with Ganondagan. So this is a really lovely case where, and I'm sorry I don't have a link handy to put in the chat, but if you can find it, it is in the media now, because it's a lovely case where an old museum has collaborated with a number of tribal nations and with Indigenous curators to bring these objects across the ocean and back into communication with Native communities. The problem often is, when is it communication and when is it repatriation? So this is not a repatriation case, it's a display, but it's a lovely opportunity. And then similarly, there are 2 belts at Chartres in France that were brought to North America, to the Shelburne Museum in the early 2000s, if I remember correctly, so that they could be seen by Abenaki and other people in that territory. So I predict there will be much more of that.
Wonderful. So many questions. If you're comfortable, we'll keep going for a few more.
I'm fine.
Great.
I'm here as long as you need me.
Kathy Foster also asks, were they made on looms?
There are some records that indicate people used bow looms. So sometimes literally like a curved bow. Sometimes, much as you do finger weaving, you could tie the ends to some stable object and weave that way. But there are not looms per se just for making wampum. So sometimes they also can be woven just lying on a flat surface. And then again, we know from the records that often wampum belts in the process of being made were being carried around while they were worked on. So it helps to have a fixed loom type object, but there is not a single pattern for doing so. And actually, while you get the next question, I'm going to pull up a few images that will illustrate exactly.
Wonderful. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually, I see so many great questions, but I'm going to combine 2 questions where people are curious about the raw materials used and how they were sourced. Asking about the shellfish used as raw material being native here in the 1600s, asking about shells available from Long Island, and were there any types of shells harvested along the coastline of New Jersey for the creation of wampum? And I believe the answer is yes, but maybe you could share more information about that material.
Yeah, the answer is definitely yes. So the whelk and quahog are all along, they don't reach as far north as the Virginia territory. And they do make it as far south as Virginia territory, and they do reach as far north as to the St. Lawrence. But what you need is that mix. So you need rivers that are emptying into the ocean and flowing continuously. And the whelk and quahog depend upon that equal mix of fresh and salt water to survive. So wherever the water is healthy and the mollusks are living, then they can be harvested. And one of the things I've found through looking at archaeological collections, and especially in my consultations with the Mohegan Nation, is that the best wampum is made on the spot. So Fort Shantok, for example, in Mohegan Territory, was a huge center for wampum production, very well documented in the archaeological record, including tribal archaeologists are finding the material right now. But in that case, the Mohegans were one of the nations that were harvesting and eating and making all at the same time. And the debris from wampum making was used as temper in making pottery. So Shantok pottery is one of the few cases in North America where the temper is not oyster shell or some other material, but it's actually whelk and quahog shell, those little fine bits that flake off when you're cutting and working on the shells to make your beads. So it's really what I call a cohesive center for wampum consumption and production. And then if I can quickly just share the images
Please.
I had wanted to bring up. So this is, let's see. So last year, the Wampanoag artisans came together. So in this case, you see Julia Martin and Linda Coombs and Paula Peters to create a new wampum belt. And this is a project that emerged out of a search for a Wampanoag belt that has long been missing and yet to be found. But with funding from Arts Council England, they hired native fishermen to collect the quahog and whelk, and mostly quahog because whelk is a little harder to find these days. Quahog is a healthier species right now. But carved the beads, created a loom. You can see the loom they made here, and then carried this around from community event to community event so that everybody in the community, children, men, women, elderly people, Wampanoag people could all have a hand in helping to bring this object to creation. And then once it was completed, the ends were left long and dangling to carry the message that Wampanoag history and culture and community continues in perpetuity. And the symbols or objects that were chosen by the artisans to represent the community, the whales, the flora, the fauna, everything that is part of their territory. It was on display in England for much of 2020. It's now back in the US, and it will be going on display at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum in probably in late 2024. But so it's a lovely example of using that old technology to create a new object. And it also gives you some visuals for that question on looms.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Recognizing just that we have run over and that there are endless numbers of questions we could address, maybe that's a great stopping point.
Okay.
I can't tell you how grateful I am to have had you speak here, and I see that echoed in the chat. People are really enjoyed this talk, so thank you. I'm also just very grateful that the Philadelphia Museum of Art is able to display this belt so that it's accessible to people for the moment, that we are the hosts of it for this moment. To everyone who joined us for our talk today, thank you. It is wonderful to share this space with you. I also want to invite you to our next upcoming talk. I'll put a link to it in the chat. It's the Ida G. Diskant Memorial Lecture, and it's titled Beyond Europe, Medieval Art in the World. It'll be on March 27th at noon. Yeah, and the many, many kind comments coming in. Thank you for such an informative presentation. I'll just echo that.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I wish you all a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon.